say for the sake of argument, your friend Gabe is starting to worry you. Gabe's always been just, a regular guy, not very political. He likes video games, sci-fi, comics, Star Wars, and anime. White guy shit. The only offbeat thing about him is you suspect there's like a 20% chance he's a furry. For all intents and purposes, Gabe is a normie. But recently, Gabe's been spending a lot of time on some radically conservative forums, and listening to radically conservative podcasts, and picking some radically conservative arguments with you and your friends. You never would have expected this, not from Gabe. And given the speed it's happened, it's worrying to think where it might be headed. How have the alt-right gotten their hooks into your friend? If you've ever known a Gabe, this video's for you. Here's how to radicalize a normie. Step 1. Identify the audience. What you need to know before we begin is around 2013, the Nazis went online. Hate groups in the US, as tracked by the Southern Poverty Law Center, had been growing in number since the Knots, but between 2012 and 2014, they dropped by almost a quarter. Patriot groups dropped by over a third. However, hate crimes stayed about the same. Radical conservatism was not shrinking, but decentralizing. Still radical and still often violent, but now full of white nationalist nomads unlikely to join a formal organization. This didn't make them harmless. What it did was protect their asses from the typical hate group cycle of getting the public's attention, making allies in conservative media, swelling their numbers, and then eventually disgracing themselves with failures in fighting and, often enough, members committing horrific acts of violence, which come with social and sometimes legal consequences for all the other members. So the alt-right and their fellow travelers these days don't so much have members. They have hashtags, followers, viewers, and subscribers. This insulates them from their own audience. If Gabe, as a member of that audience, were to go out and commit a crime on their behalf, there'd be little doubt they had a hand in radicalizing him, but it'd be very hard to claim they told him to do it. On some of these sites where Gabe spends hours and hours of his day, he's never created an account or left a comment. The people radicalizing him don't even know he's there. This distributed nature is what makes the alt-right and the movements connected to it unique. You may remember a notable proof of concept for this strategy. Doing almost everything online has, as compared with traditional hate movements, dramatically increased their reach and inoculated them from consequence. The trade-off is a lack of control. And so we come to Gabe. Gabe exists at the intersection of the kinds of people the alt-right is looking for, straight white cis men who feel emasculated by modern society, primarily, though they do make exceptions, and the kinds of people who are vulnerable to recruitment. Gabe fits the first profile in that he got bullied in high school and often feels he has to hide his nerdy side for fear of getting ridiculed. The alt-right also has success with men who can't get laid, or recently got divorced, or feel anxious about an influx of non-white people in their community. These things can make one feel like less than the confident white man they are supposed to be. And it's the closest they will ever come to being minoritized. Regarding the second profile, it's important to know that Gabe is not categorically different from you or me. He's a cishet white dude. His problems are not unique. There's not a ton of research into the demography of the alt-right, but there may be a higher than average chance Gabe has a history of being abused or comes from a broken home. You don't know if that's true of Gabe, he's never said. But most abuse survivors don't become Nazis. The things that make people like Gabe recruitable tend to be situational. It happens often during periods of transition, as dramatic as the death of a loved one, or as benign as moving to a new city. Things that make people ask big life questions. Gabe has concerns like economic precarity, not knowing his place in a changing world, stressful working conditions. In other words, Gabe is suffering under late capitalism, same as everyone, and it's entirely plausible he could have gone down the path to becoming a leftist. Now, this is not to make an economic anxiety argument. The animating force of the far right is and always has been bigotry. But the alt-right targets Gabe by treating his economic anxiety as one of many things bigotry can be sold as a solution to. It is their aim that when dissatisfied white men go looking for answers, they find the alt-right before they find us. Step 2. Establish a community. Were Gabe pledging an old-school hate movement, there would probably be a recruiter to usher him into an existing community. But that's the kind of formalized interaction modern extremists tend to avoid. Online extremism has many points of entry and everybody's journey is unique, so rather than be comprehensive, we will focus on what are, in my estimation, the two most common pathways. The far right creates a community Gabe is likely to stumble into, or infiltrates a community Gabe is already in. The stumble upon method has two main branches, one of which is just Gabe ends up on a Chan board, which we've already done a video about. The other is kind of the polar opposite of 4chan's cult of anonymity. Gabe ends up in the fandom of a far-right thought leader. These folks are charismatic media personalities. That's charismatic according to Gabe's tastes, not ours. I don't understand it either. And these personalities may gain traction on any number of platforms, from podcasts to reportage to blogging, though the most effective platform for red-pilling is, and yes, I am biting the hand that feeds me, YouTube. They may get Gabe's attention through fairly conventional means, like talking about or even generating controversy to get themselves trending, while some of the more committed will employ dubious SEO tactics like clickbait, Google bombing, and data voids. But what they tend to have in common, especially the most accessible ones, is that they don't present themselves as entry points to the radical right. In fact, many did not set out to be far-right thought leaders, and may not think of themselves as such. Though they are often selling products of which the alt-right are among their biggest purchasers, and it's not like they're turning the money away, so there's that. How they present is the same way anyone presents who wants to be successful on social media. Accessible, approachable, authentic. The face-to-face relationship a budding extremist forms with their recruiter or the leader of their hate group's local chapter are here folded into one parasocial relationship with a complete stranger. Why this person appeals to Gabe is they're not selling politics as politics, but conservatism as a kind of lifestyle brand. They rely heavily on critiquing or ridiculing the left. Feminists are oversensitive, black people unintelligent, queer folks doomed to loneliness, and trans people insane. Now, I don't know if it's a coincidence that these are all things Gabe thinks about himself in his low moments. By contrast, they don't sell conservatism as having sounder policies or a more coherent moral framework, but that abandoning progressive principles and embracing conservative ones will make Gabe happier. Remember, Gabe isn't looking for white nationalism or misogyny. What he wants is the cure to his soul sickness. And these friendly micro-celebs are here to offer a shot of life advice with politics as the chaser. It is extremely important that politics be presented as a set of affects, not a set of beliefs. The second pathway is infiltration, which is its own beast. Media personalities sometimes become gateways to the right almost by accident. They do something edgy, a part of their audience reacts positively, and facing no real consequence, they do it more. This leads to further positive reinforcement from conservative fans, the rest of the audience acclimates, and the cycle repeats, the personality pushing the envelope further and further based on what flies with their increasingly conservative audience. In this way, they become a right-wing figure by both radicalizing and being radicalized by their audience. Infiltration is deliberate. The far right will reliably target any community that has 1. A large white male population, 2. Whose niche interests allow them to feel vaguely marginalized, and 3. Who are not used to progressive critique of said interest. This isn't to say progressive critique doesn't exist or hasn't been baked into the property from the beginning, but that it has been so far easy for white guys to ignore. As such, progressives within that community probably don't talk politics much, and women and minorities are perfectly welcome to post, same as anyone, but just, don't make identity politics, like a thing. Given Gabe's proclivities, he's probably already in a number of fan communities where he can geek out and not get teased. And this is where the far right will go looking for him. Communities are at their most vulnerable to infiltration at times of political discord. This can happen naturally, say a new property in the fandom has a black protagonist, or it can be provoked, say a bunch of channers join the forum and say provocative things about race to get people arguing, or both. Left to its own devices, the community might sort out its differences and maybe even come out more progressive than they started. But with the right pressure applied in the right moment, These communities can devolve into arguments about the need to remove a nebulously defined politics from the conversation. The adage about bros on the internet is political means anything I disagree with. But it would be more accurate to say here, political means anything on which the community disagrees. For instance, Nazis are bad is an apolitical statement because everyone in the community agrees. It's common sense and therefore neutral. But paradoxically, Nazis are good is also apolitical. Because Nazis are bad is the consensus, Nazis are good must just be an edgy joke, and even if not, the community already believes the opposite, so the statement is harmless, tolerable. However, feminism is good is a political statement because the community hasn't reached a consensus. It is debatable and therefore political, and you should stop talking about it. And making political arguments, no matter how rational, is having an agenda, and having an agenda is ruining the community. Now, it is curious how the things that provoke the most disagreement tend to be whichever ones make white dudes uncomfortable, one of life's great unanswerable mysteries. You can gather where this is going. A community that doesn't tolerate progressivism, but does tolerate Nazism, is going to start collecting Nazis. Nazis whose goal is to drive a wedge between the community and the left. Once the left acknowledges, hey, your community's developing a Nazi problem, the Nazis, who are, remember, trusted apolitical members of the community who might just be kidding about all the Nazi shit, say, did you hear that, guys? Those cultural Marxists just called all of us Nazis. Wedge. Similarly, any community members who say, but Nazis, though, are framed as infiltrators pushing an agenda, even if they've been there longer than the Nazis have. They get the wedge, too. This is how fandoms radicalize. They are built as, yeah, I'll say it, safe spaces for nerds, weebs, and furries, and are told that the left is a threat to their safety. And given a choice between leaving a community that has mattered to him for years and simply adjusting to the community's shifting politics, the assumption is that Gabe will stay. This assumption is right often enough that a lot of fandoms have been colonized. What is true of both these methods, Gabe finding the right or the right finding him, is that Gabe does not come nor stay for the ideology. He's here for the community, the sense of being with his people, of having his fears validated and his enjoyment shared. The ideology is simply the price of admission. Step 3. Isolate. There is a vast, interconnected network of far-right communities out there, and Gabe is, at this point, only on the periphery. In order to keep him in, they need to disrupt his relationships to other communities and become more and more his primary online social space. Having made this space hostile to the left, they now seek to break his connections to progressives elsewhere in his life. This is hard to do online. The whole appeal of moving radicalism to the internet is that your away from keyboard life doesn't have to change. You are crypto the moment you log off. Some thought leaders will encourage their audience to cut ties with family of origin, or DFU, but even then, they can't monitor whether the audience has actually done it in the way an in-person movement could. And so alienating Gabe from the left is less controlled, and consequently, maybe less total. How much Gabe isolates is up to him. But the vast majority of far-right media presumes an alienation from the left. Part of conservative bloggers and YouTubers making the left look pathetic is doing a lot of takedowns and responses. This is a constant repetition of the left's arguments for the purpose of mockery. And for Gabe, it starts to replace any engagement with progressive media directly. He soon knows the left only through caricature. It also trains him, if he does directly engage, to approach the left with the same combative stance as his role models. For reference, see my comment section. And this is only if he doesn't partake in one of the many active boycotts of SJW media. In addition to mocking the left's arguments, they also, curiously, appropriate them. This is one part sanitization because liberal centrism is more socially acceptable. Indeed, many figures on the outer layers think of themselves as moderates even as they serve as gateways to radicalism. But also, many of Gabe's problems could be addressed by progressive leftism, so they sell him racist and sexist versions of it. Yes, There is a problem with workers being underpaid and overextended, but the solution isn't unions, it's deporting immigrants. Yes, there is a chronic loneliness and anger to being a man in the modern age, but it's not because of the toxic masculine expectations placed on you by the patriarchy, it's women being slutty. Yes, wealth disparity does mean a tiny percentage of elites have more influence over culture and politics than the rest of us combined, but the problem isn't capitalism, it's the Jews. And it's hard for Gabe to reject any of these ideas without, in the process, rejecting the progressive ideas they're copied from. The right's take the red pill is, to the untrained eye, similar to the left's get woke, or at least the Bowdlerized version of get woke that is no longer specifically about race, which came to fashion once white people started saying it. Grumble, grumble, grumble. Take the red pill or reject them both. Either is a step to the right. As this rhetoric slips into his day-to-day conversation, even as seemingly harmless irreverence, it may strain relationships with people who are not entertained by this shit. Off-color comments about race and gender can certainly be wearying for female and non-white friends, which can lead to a passive distance or an eventual confrontation, which only seems to confirm what his reactionary community says about liberal snowflakes. If he says these things on social media, he may get his account suspended. And if he comes back under an alt, you can bet his new reactionary friends will be the first to reconnect, applaud the behavior that got him banned, and repeat should he get banned again. A few cycles of this, and he's lost touch with everyone else. Also, his adoption of the insular, meme-laden terminology of his community makes him less and less comprehensible to outsiders. Over time, sources of information get replaced with community-approved ones. Conservative news, conservative YouTube, conservative Wikipedia if he's really committed. The algorithm soon takes note and stops recommending media from the left. He stops watching shows with a liberal agenda, which usually means shows starring women and people of color. Now, there is evidence that the human mind responds to fictional characters similarly to real people, and that consuming diverse media can decrease bigotry in ways roughly analogous to having a diverse group of friends, which is one of many reasons we say representation matters. By consuming a homogeneous media diet, Gabe stymies his ability to have even parasocial relationships with anyone who isn't a cishet conservative white dude or one of their approved exceptions. To the extent that any of this happens, it happens at Gabe's discretion and at his own chosen pace. It has not been forced on him, only encouraged and rewarded. But the fact that it hasn't been forced can make him all the more willing to accept it, because it seems safe to consider. Even though his life and social circle are changing to accommodate, he does not feel committed. But many Gabes have walked these halls, and if they close the door behind them, there is nowhere left to go but down. Step 4. Raise their power level. And they say we ruined anime. Consider the ecosystem of the alt-right as layers of an onion, with Gabe sitting at the edge and ready to traverse towards the center. No, I'm not just going to reiterate the Pewdie pipeline, though if you haven't seen it, I recommend that you do. The outer layer of the onion is extremism at its most plausibly deniable. Without careful scrutiny, the public-facing figureheads could pass as dispassionate, and the websites as merely problematic rather than softly fascist. It is valuable if Gabe believes this as well, that at this stage, he believed the bigotry is simply trolling, the extremists an insignificant minority, and any report of harassment faked. That he believe where he is as deep as the rabbit hole goes, and that he continue to believe this at each successive layer. People in the deepest crevices of the alt-right self-report getting red-pilled on multiple issues at different times in their journey to the center of the onion. If Gabe's first red pill is about the SJWs coming for his free speech, he'll think that's all anyone in his community believes. There's no real racism here, people are just making a point about their right to offend people. Then, when he gets red-pilled on the white genocide, he'll laugh at those alt-light cucks who tried to sweep the race realists under the rug, and at himself for having once been one, but acknowledge that those channels and websites are still useful for onboarding people, so he won't denounce them. At the same time, nobody takes those manosphere betas seriously. And this process is reiterated with every pill swallowed. Gender essentialism, autogynephilia, birtherism, Sandy Hook truth, Pizzagate, QAnon if he's really out there. The heart of the onion is typically the Jewish question, but these can happen in any order and in any number. But each layer sells itself as being finally the ultimate truth. Each denies the validity of the others. The layers ahead, they don't exist, and you are certainly not being directed towards them. They're just the fevered imaginations of overreacting liberals, while the people behind are asleep, where you are now awake. That's why they chose the red pill as their metaphor. Take it, and everything will be revealed. That's why it cozies up with conspiracism. But what's supposed to follow is that this knowledge help Gabe in some way, and it doesn't. Blaming immigrants doesn't actually fix the economy, and hating women doesn't make men less lonely. But having been alienated from everything outside the onion, once that sinks in, the only recourse on offer is to seek out the next pill. And pills are easy to find. Those within the network have laissez-faire relationships, even if they on paper disavow one another. When they need a source or a guest host, they aren't going to go to the left. They're going to feature each other. The left is the enemy. Their ideas are beneath consideration, and the only reason to engage them is for public humiliation. But you can interview a Western chauvinist, and that doesn't mean you're endorsing him. Just, it's fine to hear him out. Nothing should be off limits in the marketplace of ideas. Besides, Nazis are apolitical. And because these folks keep showing up in each other's metadata, regardless of what they say, Google thinks there is definitely a relationship between the guy just asking questions and the guy denying the Holocaust. Gabe is softly exposed to many flavors of conservatism, just slightly more radical than he is now, and is expected, at the very least, to not question their presence. This is an environment where de-radicalizing, listening to the left, would be sleeping with the enemy. But radicalizing further, you do you, buddy. Gabe's emotional journey, however, is somewhat more complex. If you spend any time reading or watching reactionary media, you've probably noticed it's really fucking repetitive. It's a few thousand phrasings of the same handful of arguments, like there's only so many jokes about attack helicopters. But these people just crank out content, and most of it's derivative. The reason to pick one personality over another isn't because they say something different, but because they say it differently. Gabe just picks the affect it's delivered in. Repetition dulls the shock of the most egregious statements, making them appear normal and prepping him for more extreme ideas. Meanwhile, the arguments themselves, they're not good. Like, BreadTube will never run out of shit to debunk. They are repetitive because they're not good. They're mantric. A good argument you only need to hear one time. If you can follow it, internalize it, and explain it to someone else, you know you've understood it. But a bad argument can't convince you on its own merits, so it will often rely on affect. This can be the snappy, thought-terminating cliche, or the long, winding diatribe that sounds really sensible while you're hearing it, but when someone asks you for the gist, you can only say, go watch these 17 videos and it'll all make sense. Both these approaches are largely devoid of content, but gosh, if they don't sound sure of themselves. And that mode can be very persuasive, but it doesn't stick the way a coherent argument does. It needs to be repeated, the affect replenished, because the words matter less than the delivery. There needs to be a steady stream of confident voices saying, we've got this shit figured out and everyone else is stupid, or Gabe's gonna notice the flaws. They are not well hidden. And the catch-22 of returning to that stream over and over is that these communities are stressful even as they are calming. People afraid they will die virgins go to forums with people who share and validate that fear, and also say, yes, you will die a virgin. People afraid Syrians are coming to kill us all watch videos by people who share and validate that fear, and also say, yes, Syrians are coming to kill us all. Others have already pointed out that rubbing your face in your worst anxieties is a form of digital self-harm, but I need you to understand the toxic recursion of it. Gabe is going to these communities to get upset. Every emotion is converted into anger because sadness, fear, and despair are paralyzing, but anger is motivating. Whatever his problems, there's always someone he can scapegoat for them, and Gabe feels less helpless when he's pissed off. And so while he's topping up on reassuring nonsense, he's also topping up on stress. And being cut off from everyone outside the network, the only place he knows to go to release that stress is back to the place that gives it to him. It's a feedback loop, pulling him deeper and deeper on the promise that, at some point, relief will come. It is a similar dynamic that keeps people in abusive relationships. When someone in Gabe's community makes a racist joke, they are presenting Gabe with a choice between the human interaction of laughing with his friends and his societal responsibility not to be a fucking racist. And not laughing seems ridiculous. Everybody's friends here, no one's getting hurt. This is harmless. And so the irreverent race joke draws a line between the personal and the political and suggests that one can be safely prioritized over the other. One way to look at radicalization is being asked to stick with that seemingly innocuous decision as the stakes are raised incrementally. First with edgier humor, and then comments that are funny because they're shocking, but you couldn't really call them jokes, and then funny comments that are also sincerely angry. But in each instance, since he laughed with his bros the last time, it stands to reason he should keep favoring the personal over some abstracted notion of politics. This is why the progressive adage, "the personal is political," is among the most threatening things you can say in these spaces. I'm not trying to make a slippery slope argument. Most of us who laughed at edgy jokes when we were teenagers didn't grow up to be Nazis. It is a slippery slope in the specific context of being in community with people trying to radicalize you. Gabe is a lonely white boy in need of friends, and laughing at a racist joke is personal, and not laughing is political. Staying in a community that has Nazis in it is personal, and leaving is political. The personal is what brings people together, and the political drives them apart. The "only if some of them are bigots" part of that sentence is usually lopped off. There's this joke on the internet that nerds perceive only two races, white and political. Following that logic, what could be more apolitical than an ethno-state? They are banking on his willingness to adapt his beliefs to suit an environment that meets a need. That same need can be satisfied by white nationalism. There are few things more seductive to people who doubt their own worth than being told, "You are valuable simply for being white, and you can sub in male, cis, straight, allosexual, or able-bodied." It just takes priming. By the time Gabe officially embraces bigotry, he's already been acting like a bigot for months. The red pill is just the moment he says it out loud. Change Gabe's surroundings, and you change Gabe. Step 5. The final step in a traditional extremist group would be getting a mission. But that is one thing the alt-right can't do. Once you start giving clear directives, you can't play yourselves off as a bunch of unaffiliated hashtags and think tanks. You are now a formalized movement accountable to its followers, and can be judged and policed as such. To my mind, Charlottesville was an attempt to become such a movement, taking things offline and getting all the different groups working collectively. And as so often happens when these people get in the same space, especially with no official leaders and no means of control over their members, it backfired. Their true colors came out before they were ready, and a counter-protester lost her life. This would be the point where historically an extremist group starts to disintegrate. Their veneer of respectability gone, they are now hated by the public, the media wants nothing more to do with them, and everyone not in jail turns on each other or goes underground. This is also the point where the liberal establishment says, "My job here is done," and utterly fails to retake control of the narrative, allowing the next batch of radicals to pick up more or less where the last one left off. But to an already decentralized group like the alt-right, Charlottesville was bad, but eminently survivable. People retreated back to the internet with its code words and anonymous forums, but that's where much of the work was already done anyway. The platforms where they organized kept tolerating them, the authorities didn't classify them as terrorists, and any disgraced figureheads were replaced with up-and-comers. The major change in strategy is that it doesn't seem anyone has tried to formalize the alt-right since. So where does that leave Gabe? He's gone through this whole process of largely hands-off indoctrination, and I should stress, his journey may look like what we've outlined here, or it may look different in places. This video is not comprehensive. But now he's swallowed every pill he cares to, he blames half a dozen minorities for everything he sees as wrong with the world, and no one will give him anything to do. You've got this ad hoc movement frothing young men into a militant fervor, and then just leaving them to stew in their own hate. Should we really be surprised at how many commit mass shootings? This is a machine for producing lone wolves. Leaving men to take up arms of their own volition is a way of enacting terror while being just outside the popular conception of a terror cell. There are also, of course, more classic militias that will offer Gabe clear directives. They are recruiting from the same pool. And Gabe may stop short of this, settling in a middle layer that suits him or finding the inner layers too extreme. But violence is the logical conclusion of an ideology of hate. And should Gabe take this step, he can approach violence in the same incremental fashion he approached conservatism. He can start with yelling at people on Twitter, and then maybe collective brigading, DDoS attacks, sharing docs, leaking nudes, calling their phone numbers, texting them pictures of their houses from the sidewalk. These acts of cruelty become games of one-upmanship within his community. All this can start as far back as step 2 and get more intense the deeper he goes. And some people join explicitly to partake in harassment and violence the way Gabe joined to talk about anime. But this behavior can serve as a kind of buy-in. The left and the feminists and the LGBTQs and the Muslims and the immigrants are all within his community subhuman. You've maybe heard the conservative catchphrase, feminism is cancer. Well, you don't treat cancer by having a respectful exchange of ideas with it, but by eradicating it down to the last cell. Cruelty against the left is framed as necessary and righteous. From any other perspective, posting someone's bank information is something you might feel ashamed of, which creates a psychological imperative not to consider other perspectives. A thing that keeps people in is staving off the guilt they will reckon with the moment they step out. Gabe is also aware that anything he's done to the left could be done to him if he leaves. Some communities even keep docs on their members as insurance. And the things he's encouraged to do to the left will likely make him feel that the left would never take him now. The radical right is the only home he's got. Harassment becomes another tool of isolation. Steadily, options for Gabe are whittled down to being a vigilante or a nihilist. There are periods of elation, moments the alt-right feels it's winning, or more accurately, the people they hate are losing, are like cocaine. They are authoritarians after all. But the times in between are mean and angry. They are antisocial, starved of emotional connection, consuming incompatible conspiracies that may at any point run them afoul of one another, devoted to figureheads who cater to but cannot risk leading them, and living under constant threat of being outed to the left or turned on by the right for stepping out of line. Gabe took this journey for the sense of community and purpose, and but for the rare moments everything goes their way, the alt-right can't maintain either. They can only keep promising his day will come, a story he could get from a $5 palm reading. The feeling there's nothing left but to kill yourself or someone else is so common, it's a meme. But there is a third option. Gabe can leave. Pre-conclusion, for fuck's sake do not make Gabe your whole ass praxis. Before we continue, I want to state plainly that Gabe went off the deep end because he found a community willing to tell him that because he is a cishet white man, the world revolves around him. Do not treat him like this is true. If a fraction of the energy spent having debates with America's Gabes were spent instead on voter reenfranchisement, prisoners' rights, protections for immigrants, statehood for DC, and redistricting, Gabe's opinions, in the societal sense, wouldn't matter. Reactionary conservatism is a small and largely unpopular ideology that is only so represented in our culture and politics because they've learned how to game the system. And I get it. Those are huge problems that are going to take years to address, where if you know a Gabe, that's a conversation you could have today. And if you think you can get through to him, it's worthwhile to try. This is a fight on many fronts, and de-radicalization is one of them. But it is only one. So please keep it in perspective. It sends an awful message when we spend more time trying to get bigots back on our side than we do the people they are bigoted against. Your value as a lefty does not hinge on whether you can change Gabe's mind. Conclusion. How Gabe gets out. He may just grow out of it. These communities skew young, and some folks hit a point where hanging out with edgy teens doesn't feel cool anymore. He may become disillusioned after the movement fails to deliver on its many promises. He may become disillusioned if something goes wrong in his life and his community isn't there for him. If he feels they like his race and his gender, but don't actually care about him. He may be shocked if he sees the alt-right at its worst before being appropriately conditioned. Charlottesville was a step too far for a lot of people. His community may turn on him for any perceived unorthodoxy, and he may leave out of necessity. He may be separated by circumstance from the community, a trip with no internet, hospitalization, arrest, and not be able to top up on the rhetoric. This may lead him to question his beliefs. His community may disappear, either tearing itself apart or getting shut down by authorities. He may have incidental contact with populations he is supposed to hate, and have trouble reconciling who they are in person with what he's been told about them. In his community, people bond over shared intolerance, but suddenly being tolerant helps him make friends. This is one reason the alt-right has made a battleground of the liberal arts college campus. He may form or revisit relationships outside the network, people who can offer him the connection he's been looking for. This may reintroduce outside perspectives, but more importantly, it rekindles his ability to have healthy relationships at all, something the alt-right has estranged him from. As with recruiters, it seems these escape hatch relationships can sometimes be parasocial, coming to respect a public figure who is on the left or is critical of the alt-right. Someone he is close to may compel him to choose me or the movement. A lot of young men leave to save a romantic relationship. Hearing stories from people who've already jumped may help. There aren't a lot of public formers, and some raise questions as to their sincerity, but it is getting more common and may be the closest we get to exit counseling for the alt-right. He may become aware of the ways he's being manipulated, or have them revealed to him, maybe because he stumbled into BreadTube, I don't know. Knowledge that you are being indoctrinated is no guarantee it won't work. You are not immune to propaganda, but it can help one resist. And he may revisit a core belief system that used to guide him, be it religion or social justice, or a really wholesome fandom, and be reminded of the identity he used to have. Moments like these, in isolation or in aggregate, can inspire Gabe to jump. They are also good times for friends to intervene. The reach and the impunity that comes with the internet means it has never been easier to fall into reactionary conservatism. It has also never been easier to get out. People who exit skinhead gangs often fear for their lives. For Gabe, there's a chance getting out is as simple as going to a different website. Much of his community does not know his name or his face, and he may not be important enough to dox. What doesn't get Gabe out, not reliably, not that I have seen, is an argument with a stranger who proves all his facts wrong and his ideology bunk. Facts don't always work because facts don't care about his feelings. This was about staying in a community and holding on to an identity that mattered to him. It was about belonging. And that is something a rando from the other side of the culture war can't give him and probably shouldn't be responsible for. The theme here is human connection. Before he can do the work of disentangling himself and facing the guilt of what he's believed and maybe done, he has to know there's something for him on the other end of it. That the right hasn't ruined him. They've told him all of history is groups fighting each other over status and that without his clan he'll be in exile. He needs a better story. I don't know that lefty spaces are ideal for this, in no small part because bringing someone who's a bit of a Nazi but working on it into diverse communities is questionable. And it probably wouldn't be good for him either. Having just gotten out of a toxic belief system, he's going to be deeply skeptical of all ideologies. In a perfect world, people who care about Gabe could build for him, to use a therapy term, a holding space. Someplace private, physical or digital, where Gabe can work out his feelings, where he is both encouraged and expected to be better, but is not in the moment judged. That comes later. It is delicate and time-consuming work that should not be done in public, but we find these beliefs built up over the course of months or years tend to fall away very quickly with a shift of environment. Change Gabe's surroundings and you change Gabe. But instead, a lot of people who jump are functionally deprogramming themselves, which is working for a lot of them, but it's haphazard, and there are recidivists. If you don't personally know a Gabe or have training as a counselor, you may not be in a position to help him. Possibly there are things you can do to disrupt the recruitment process or prevent infiltration of spaces you're in. I'm looking into it, but talk to your mods. But elephant in the room, meaningful change will require reform on the part of platform holders. Tools to disrupt this process already exist and are being used on groups like ISIS, but they're not being used on the alt-right because they try oh so hard not to get classified as terrorists. And also any functioning anti-radicalization policy would require banning a lot of conservative politicians. So there's that. But what makes our story better than theirs is that the fight for social and economic justice, though it is long and difficult and frustrating, when it works, it fulfills the promise the right can't keep. It materially makes people's lives better. I am not prone to sentimentality or to giving these videos happy endings. But one thing we have that the alt-right doesn't is hope.